So it looks like if we stick to timing on that, we'll have some time for Q&A as a wrap up. So if think back through and please prepare questions. I did not set up this call for an open mic, so we're going to have to collect questions through Skype or the chat channels in the session. So just to give you a heads up that we'll be able to go do some back and forth on that, although I suspect this last topic is going to require a full 20 minutes of discussion. Wow. Okay. So this last topic has been subject of a lot of discussion internal to the team, a lot of discussion I've had with numerous partners, customers, community members, and I guess that's why I saved the best for last. And I need to stage it carefully and describe it, and then we'll walk through some interesting use cases here.
And I'll probably just trash all the staging, but that's okay.
Yes, you will. That's good. So when we started Crowbar, we made some decisions. It's pretty commonly known. We actually had started with Puppet, switched to Chef for a variety of reasons. And one of the decisions that we made in the course of those changes was that we would use Chef as our database, which we are backing away from to an extent. And one of the other things we did to get things moving more quickly is that we built Crowbar-isms into our cookbooks. So we didn't really know the right place to make abstractions and to create separation of concerns between Crowbar and Chef at the time. I think that any guesses we made would have been off to one extent or another, and so we didn't. It's part of the incremental architecture philosophy. And now, after a year of doing this, actually 18 months, a year, Crowbar's been public for a year. We've been doing Crowbar itself as a project for 18 months. We have a much better idea on where to do this. So we are ready to take steps, and this is going to be one of the biggest breaking changes, or it's hopefully not breaking per se, but enabling changes for people, is that we're pulling out the Crowbar-isms from Crowbar-ism requirements from Chef, from our cookbooks. And what that means is that you will be able to write cookbooks that use Crowbar and are Crowbar enabled, but don't require Crowbar. So those cookbooks should be able to operate without Crowbar. So if somebody wanted to take the existing open source SQL database cookbooks and add Crowbar capabilities into them, those cookbooks could work for the community still, but enable networking, hardware bring up, integration with other cookbooks. So you could take advantage of things without effectively forcing the community cookbooks to adopt Crowbar. We hear a lot of enthusiasm when we talk to people in the community and customers about this. One of the things that it will enable us to do, and we are working, Matt Ray has been a champion of this, and we are supporting it. Actually, we'll be talking tomorrow at OSCON about this specific topic, is to hopefully move to our OpenStack cookbooks to upstream from ops code instead of upstream or having them sourced in Crowbar. And let me explain that, try and explain it briefly. I wrote a long post about upstreaming. Please read that if the word upstreaming is confusing. But what it means is that anybody in the community can share knowledge and contribute to the OpenStack cookbooks. We are the leading author of a lot of those cookbooks, but because of the Crowbar injection, people cloned them, pulled out the Crowbar pieces, and they're no longer compatible. So we created a lot of unmergeable forks. We want to avoid that, so we're trying to move to have ops code maintain the OpenStack cookbooks. They've agreed to take this on. They asked for that, and that will allow us to, we'll have to push our changes back to them and then pull those changes back. But the Crowbar-isms will not break people who choose not to use Crowbar. There's a significant component with this in that we're doing this. It means that you don't have to use Chef necessarily as the only deployment mechanism, because we'll have some flexibility there, and that's an abstraction component that I'll let Greg dig into a little bit. But it has pretty significant ramifications. So in order to upstream, we've had to create a much cleaner separation. And that's really what we're going to focus on here, is what that separation means and what its impact is, not so much the product ramifications from a broader perspective. Is there something I'm missing that's significant before I tread into really deep water? Okay.
So we call it attribute-driven recipes because in the end, that seems to be the model that works with most of the deployment tools, is that somebody gives them a set of attributes, descriptors, something, that then get translated into the appropriate set of data on the downstream side. Crowbar, especially given the database changes that we're talking about, has a way to maintain this. And most of the systems have ways to inject those attributes back into their control structures, either through, like for Chef, we'll still probably use roles, but the roles, in some regards, it will look very similar today. But what the plan is to move a lot of the things around, network discovery and the things we have kind of in side library calls into specific attributes that get set on either a node role or the actual kind of, if you're familiar with the structure of the bar clamp instance role, so that those attributes get injected kind of per recipe into the system. And the idea is that we'll create a abstraction layer inside of the Crowbar framework that will handle taking from the bar clamp's view of those attributes in Crowbar and converting them into the appropriate injection method for whatever CMDB we're choosing, right? I'm using that term loosely. Be it scripts, Chef, Puppet, Juju, whatever we look at one of these days, right?
Significant number of customers have homegrown investments.
All that stuff becomes an option, and then the bar clamp, through this kind of injection layer, can choose how those attributes get injected. And so for Chef, that kind of continues to look like what we have today, but it's a cleaner abstraction of what attributes we're setting versus how they actually end up in Crowbar or in Chef, because we currently have those concepts merged. The other aspect of this is that it doesn't mean that the recipes don't have to be changed. The recipes still may need to be changed, but hopefully the changes that are needed will be able to be upstreamed into the various owners' cookbooks up top. So a lot of times, one of the biggest areas that we have problems with are around networking. So we may currently split out networking to have public sides and internal sides and external sides and stuff like that. The problem is a lot of the recipes don't necessarily currently comprehend multiple IP addresses. So we need to add attributes that will default to the same internal or single attribute, but those will need to be pushed back out to the external repos so that those attributes are available for Crowbar to set for breadth. Now, our belief is those pushes to the upstream communities shouldn't be that big of a deal, because they'll default to what they already default to and give us the added flexibility to change them. In some regards, it gives us the opportunity to broaden the configurability of the upstream recipes.
And one of the things that we're expecting to happen is that some of the networking benefits with Crowbar, where there's a lot of network configuration and normalization, are things that people could pick up in cookbooks, and will make cookbooks themselves potentially, or other CMDBs, we're not limiting ourselves to Chef from that perspective, more powerful and more consistent across the cookbooks. Or I'm so used to saying cookbooks.
Yeah. Configuration methods.
Deployment code.
So Dan voting asks a question of, will the data injection process be a published API? This actually points out an interesting aspect. So this attribute-driven method is more of a publish. So there's two aspects to what most of the CMDBs provide. One is, I want this done this way, take these actions, and from our perspective and our terms, we view that as an export of attributes into the CMDB through whatever method. Then there's the actual ingesting of attribute data, for lack of a better term. Think of it as your factor data or your OHI data, and all of the additional things that these tools discover as data that needs to be injected into Crowbar. Both layers we're working on an abstraction piece for, because we need that data in Crowbar so that the bar clamps can make intelligent decisions about loading and distribution, discovery, configuration. And so we need that. So now, will those be APIs? The goal for injecting data into Crowbar is to define at least something that handles that injection process. Now, and hopefully it's in a pluggable way that we can then have third-party and other tools inject data in these attributes for nodes and just general system information into Crowbar. Will there be an explicit API? We're still in the process of defining that. It'd be potentially good to have an API. It's not off the table, but I'm not sure it's completely on the table either. There's some import and translation effects that have to occur at that layer. And so we're less certain that it can be just a raw API, but it may be a
object overload.
Yeah, it could be an overload of an object or an extension of a base class or something that allows you to do the basic translations that you need from whatever data type into the appropriate API schema or database schema that we have.
Right. We do in the data model have already been discussing that we're going to have parent classes that have a base definition, but individual models would be able to have their own data models, have their own data tables, have their own injections. With Rails, we can be really loose and flexible with this, and we expect to be. So depending on how we do this extension, you could actually model your factor data or OHI data however you felt necessary and store it. You could cache it. You could leave it as blobs. You could stick it as text. It's really going to end up being an object model definition right now, but we're open to discussion on how the APIs work.
Yeah. Also, since we think of things oftentimes in terms of per bar clamp, there's times where, like, the networking bar clamp may choose to store, specific OHI information or factor information independent of the others. So this API transform may actually be a basic framework system that bar clamps can plug in pieces that allow them to inject facts into the underlying system based upon their usage. So there's a whole area that needs to be designed and built around here, but these are some of our first order thoughts. We have to solve this sooner than later as we move to the database aspect. The database aspect drives a lot of this stuff. In some regards, the work to change the recipes to just straight attributes is not necessarily, it's not small, but it's also not a lot. The bigger work is actually in these two transform layers of getting data into the Crowbar database and out of it. The extraction path is similar. It will need, and so this is a case where the extraction path provides does the transform, and this is where we need to allow for different models. And so, like in the chef model, that one we understand really well, and it will still be changing the chef server, updating it, and then letting nodes drive off of that data. In some of our initial Puppet evaluation to make sure we just don't write ourselves into a corner. It may be the case that we choose to have that layer expose a Puppet classifier endpoint so that the Puppet server master functionality could call into the Crowbar, and then those would pass through these bar clamp transport layers to pass back manifests and other kind of functions that way. The point is this transform layer is meant to provide a place for interfacing between the Crowbar database and its set of information that the bar clamps are maintaining to the actual configuration tool that's being chosen to use, right? And the idea is that this could be, like I said, Chef, it could be Puppet, it could be Juju. We even have some cases of bootstrapping to do just raw scripting, right?
So Dan's asking if it's pull or push.
And so to that,
It's a good question.
We're trying not to preclude either, right? The Chef model would be push. The Puppet model, as kind of traditionally viewed, that may have changed. I haven't, so Dan, there could be new data, so I'm not sure, could be more handled as a pull-driven path, right? So it can go either way. The idea is not to preclude it and to let that transform layer handle it. So
each one of those configuration databases have different strengths and different approaches to this problem. We have some experience with both. We are obviously Dan Bode's on the call, and Matt Ray's been involved with this too. We have both. We're taking input and feedback on both.
Yeah, so I mean that'd be awesome, right? From our perspective, we weren't trying to preclude a design choice there. The idea is with the transform, the goal would be to deal with let the transfer layer drive it. Andy, with regard to the pull being problematic, the idea is that data is mostly constant. And so we could pre-calculate what those pulls would do, just like we can pre-calculate what the pushes are. So in some regards, you could view that transform path as being potentially independent from the transform pull path being similarly separated from the push path so that data is maintained separately. There's ways we'd have to solve it, but it's achievable.
Right. I'm just as a note, I'm not planning for the video to necessarily have the chat summary, so we should make sure we reframe the questions for that. But I'm trying. I think we're. So I'm going to come back to something that is the mantra for this. Right. We're staging these changes to enable this. Our first goal is the upstreaming and the separation of concerns, so that Crowbar and Chef have an air gap between them. We have a lot of objectives to bring in other configuration. We're working with partners. If people want to see this happen and want to help create a broader aspect for configuration management databases, those are things where we definitely are going to want community assistance, where we're ready to engage people, and I'll discuss that a little bit in the summary when I talk about Summit and some things that we're doing with that. So once again, it's important to realize we're trying to tee up this and the APIs. We're going to do this incrementally and try and create the right basis for this going forward. We need your input, and then we want your help so that we can actually start testing these out, making the changes, getting the feedback to make this right. Once again, the start of a dialogue, not the conclusion. Okay. And what I suspect will happen is to make this, we will actually, I know we're going to end up having subtopic meetings and discussions around these topics. If we hear from the community that there's a need to do it with voice and interaction, we will happily do it with voice and interaction at scheduled times. That is part of what we want to accomplish with this. I'm going to save more on that for the wrap up. Do we have more to discuss for attribute config?
I think that's about it. That's the general idea. In some regards, we're focused on the Chef transforms because that's what we have today. As we go forward, as we see more community interest, the Puppet or Juju or script aspects will be addressed as we move along, right? So.
Okay, I'm updating the notes here to reflect what's going on. Saying that we're going to look to accommodate push and pull, and the transformation layer drives it. We weren't trying to be so prescriptive in statements, and so once again, we'll step back from this. There's another goal in attribute-driven recipes for us, which is sort of ultimately a table stakes item, but we want to make it much easier to do bar clamps. Making bar clamps easier to do from your configuration deployment scripts is one of the important things we see. We have heard very clearly that it takes a lot of expertise to build a bar clamp. We want to dramatically lessen that curve, in part because we want to be able to use community deployment code with less change. And we also want to just make things easier. There's me having to go to OSCON soon. And so that is really one of the things that we want to do. So an underlying theme for this separation is that we can make bar clamp development easier, faster, more flexible. Is there one or two things that you want to highlight, Greg, from that perspective that we're going to do?
From the SDK perspective?
SDK perspective.
So part of it's documentation. We think the attribute-driven recipe part helps with that, in the sense that we hope that once that philosophy and implementation's in place, it'll be much easier to take the external known recipes that are available and use them more just out of the box, where you can wrap the things you want to configure of those existing attributes and push them in or out of the system. Now, with that said, we still think bar clamp's value is in the orchestration and control of those multi-node bring-ups. So a lot of the code that you have to deal with in a bar clamp is around what does it mean to deploy multi-node, what goes where, how do you split that functionality. A lot of the recipes already have that conceptually there. And so that's not necessarily a huge problem, but it's something that you have to consider. We think that some of the documentation changes will help so that you can start defining what you want as documentation in the product to show up with your bar clamp, which may not be important for like a one-off customer bar clamp, but is more important for those wanting to provide bar clamps on top of Crowbar to a wider audience, so that it can have a more integrated feel in the documentation and the UI in general.
So, for example, if there was a RabbitMQ bar clamp, then that RabbitMQ could have documentation that described RabbitMQ and all the components and configurations and aspects to that stand by itself. And if OpenStack used RabbitMQ, then it would inherit the documentation capabilities for that. So there's an incentive to build good bar clamps with good wrappers, with good patterns. And from my experience looking at this, a lot of the challenge that we have for the configuration deployment code is not so much the Crowbarisms, but the patterns, right? In order for us to create the orchestration that we feel like is really valuable, the networking configuration that we feel like is really valuable, the multi-node awareness, it requires a coding pattern and discipline that most people haven't needed to do because they're doing more one-off deployments. And so it's still going to be on us in an SDK to describe the patterns and the coding patterns for that.
Yeah, and this is kind of the steps and how far we go on the SDK, right? I think some of the initial ones are point out and document how you use those other features as you build bar clamps. And then there's a whole set of secondary features around adding the ability to more actively clone a bar clamp, more quickly create a shell bar clamp. In some regards, right, revamping our kind of bar clamp example model code because it's more documentation than kind of usable code at the current moment. It describes a lot of the things you can do, but isn't necessarily a good clonable example, right? And addressing some of those kind of things. I think it's needed for documentation or in addition to documentation, but adding more kind of a couple example bar clamps that are shells that you could start from. Those kind of things I think would be good steps down the SDK path to get us more to a point where we can start getting better feedback from the community around what's going on and stuff like that.
Okay.
Actually, another aspect of what Andy and I were talking on Skype about the kind of the attribute and whether pull or push and availability and orchestration. One of the things that some of this work is also allowing us to do is to potentially do per or recipe-specific runs of the configuration tool. And so this is kind of a feature that Chef has slowly been working on that they haven't gotten out yet. But the idea is I want to run my Nova recipes. I don't want to run any of the other recipes right now, or just enough of the Nova recipes with some other stuff. And it may be applicable to Puppet as well. We're not as sure. And that's why you had some of the differences between Andy and I on the Skype channel of looking in violent agreement, because there's times where there's things we've talked about where it'd be really nice to be able to say, I just want to bring up Nova. I don't want to gyrate through all the other stuff because I've already got it configured. So just do the steps to finish configuring Nova. All right. Oh, and that may include network steps and stuff like that, but let's handle that based on the bar clamps knowing what roles to inject for the next run of either Puppet and dealing with that as a manifest pull. And so that leads to much more complex orchestration options of I want to bring up this set of features on this node, but I can't bring the full feature set up until I do something on 3 other nodes. So then bring those up and then come back and finish the configuration on the original first node. Those kind of functions become more available as we start expanding this kind of attribute-driven recipe with this transform layer. And then some metadata in the bar clamp to help drive what it means to do orchestration. You can also see this as a path towards maybe doing things like upgrades and rolling upgrades and those kind of features as you look to use Crowbar more of your ongoing operations than just a deployment tool.